Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Thinking Thursdays research seminar series. And I'm really, really glad to introduce to all of you my dear friend and colleague from the Education University of Hong Kong, Professor Liz Jackson. Liz and I actually share a lot of connections with regards to our university, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the US. We are both alma mater of this university. And actually, Liz and I both worked under the same doctoral supervisor for our PhDs, so from different institutions. And I have been following Liz's work for several years. She's much senior to me and somebody who I really look up to with regards to her work and scholarship, and look forward to personally learn from Liz's work. Liz Jackson is currently a professor in the Department of International Education at the Education University of Hong Kong. She's also the immediate past president of the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia and former director of the Comparative Education Research Center at the University of Hong Kong. Her research interests include philosophy of education and moral and civic education. Today, as you all know, Liz is going to talk on this topic, Beyond Virtue, the Politics of Educating Gratitude and Humility. And this talk is actually based on one of Liz's recent publications. She is actually prolific. I still remember doing a review of Liz's first book in 2016, coming out of her PhD thesis at a conference. And since then, she has published 5 books, Liz, I think, or more.
Yeah, I think including with some co-authors, it's about that. Yeah.
also several articles, and all very illuminating, very intellectually engaging work. This particular book is specifically very relevant within the current context, though, as Liz is going to, of course, share with all of you, she began this work much long ago, before the current COVID crisis, but increasingly so. The relevance of her work is become very prominent right now in the context of the COVID crisis, and the need for thinking about emotional well-being and social and emotional learning in schools. I'm not going to say too much myself, because frankly speaking, we are all looking forward to hear from Liz what she has to say. All of you must have read the short abstract that we circulated, and I just don't want to read out the abstract any longer. Rather, I would like to invite Liz to share her presentation and begin the presentation for all of you. Over to you, Liz.
Well, thank you so much, Masumi. It's wonderful to see you. So, like Masumi said, we've been in close contact over the years. So it's great for us to be able to do this despite the distance we face at the moment. Thank you to all of you for coming today. I know it's very hectic time in India, and the media I'm seeing from Hong Kong, it looks like it's a really bad situation. So I'm glad to see. I was, based on the news, I thought, is anyone going to show up today? So thank you very much for showing up, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. So as Masumi mentioned, I'm going to summarize some things from my recent book, which is Beyond Virtue. It's called The Politics of Educating Emotions. And I'm going to focus on 2 emotions today, which are gratitude and humility. Are they emotions? Are they virtues? This is something that the book talks about quite a bit. And the reason I'm focusing on gratitude and humility is because I'm actually working on a new project since I've joined the Education University in the last year, you can look us up online. The project is called VIEW, and it's Virtues in Education, East Meets West. And we're focusing on gratitude and humility for this project. So I'm mentioning this because this book discusses a lot of philosophies, but it's mostly comparing East and West because I'm originally from the States and well-versed in Western philosophy and philosophy of education. But since I've been in Hong Kong for almost 10 years now, I'm very interested in philosophies of this part of the world. So in the book, I talk a lot about Western philosophy and Chinese philosophy. Sometimes I discuss some philosophies from India, but not often, not very well or effectively, especially when it comes to mindfulness and yogic practice in Western countries. I discuss some of the Indian roots around that. So I'm happy if you want to discuss those things. I'd be very interested to hear your views coming from a different cultural context than those I'm focusing on in the book. So really happy to keep a dialogue going during the session today, and after the session, you can feel free to be in touch with me. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to discuss the different views of emotions and what I describe as emotional virtues in my sort of understanding. And then I'm going to apply this understanding, which is sort of three-pronged view, going to apply that understanding to discuss two different virtues, gratitude and humility. One thing people ask is why these two virtues? There's no, is there a relationship between the two? Well, from a virtue ethics perspective or a psychology perspective, all these things are interrelated. So yes, they are interrelated. For me, I've worked on gratitude for a long time, for several years. And I think when you compare Western to Chinese views of gratitude, you find some very interesting things. Humility is actually a newer topic for me. So I guess, you could say that these are picked at random almost, but they reveal sort of the diverse structure and understanding of emotional virtues. So I hope that's something that comes across today. But in the book, I discuss happiness, mindfulness, resilience, grit, compassion and empathy, anger, sadness, and fear, I believe, are the main ones, and a little bit of discussion of courage and vulnerability. So these are just sort of picked at random. And if you're interested in thinking about happiness or other topics, hopefully you have the book in your library, or you can email me to discuss it more. So in the book, there's more than three views of emotions, right? Every field views emotions in a certain way. If I was to focus on anthropology has a very rich discussion of virtues across cultures. But for this book, I focused on three views of emotions, which I think are central when we consider education around emotions. And as we were just discussing before the session began, there's a big turn in education, even before the COVID pandemic, about happiness in education, the sense that education needs to work on emotional virtues. And so I argue that psychological and philosophical views about emotions go hand in hand in these discourses, while a political view is something I try to introduce. I try to bring up, there's a politics to educating about emotions, which sometimes is underneath the surface of the discussions. So to start with a psychological view of emotion, so this is a very distinctive approach to emotions. To summarize the role of psychological views of emotions in education, psychology has, in the United States context and in Chinese context, I would guess from a global view, certainly from a kind of global international standard view, psychology has, without a doubt, had the major influence on the way we see emotions in education. And the reason for that is because it focuses on what a sociologist would call a functional view of the individual in society. So there's this idea that the individual needs to fit in and adapt to the system they're in, that system being the school, the classroom, and that system being the society and the political economy of the society. So from this perspective, psychologists view emotions as something that either helps people adapt to that system and fit into that system, or hinders them from that. And there's a rich history in psychological oriented research on what we call academic emotions today. So academic emotions today we might call curiosity, open-mindedness, patience. Like these are emotional dispositions, and dispositions that have an emotional connotation, which help a person to succeed in tests and in class and so on. And then there's sort of negative hindrance emotions. So they'll call negative emotions, they say anger, because if you're angry, you can't do well on a test, you can't listen to a lecture if you're angry. So that will be a negative emotion from a psychological view. Historically, it was discussed as mental hygiene, and it was seen as a very important thing that people have this mental hygiene. And whether it's a mental or emotional phenomenon, I'm interested in either case. I think they discuss it as mental hygiene and academic emotions because there's an orientation here towards the common notions of learning and the importance of learning for education, but a lot goes on in education beyond learning, which I'm also interested in. So psychologists, if you think about the field of psychology, psychologists have a certain way of understanding emotions. So they could use direct observation. So is a student is presenting before a classroom. Are they anxious? Are they stuttering? Are they breathing really heavy? Are they shaking? Maybe someone's shaking. Do they turn bright red? So these are ways we can say, okay, this person's anxious because we can see these things about them. But that really doesn't help in all situations when it comes to understanding emotions. So psychologists also depends to a great degree on self-reports and reports from others. So maybe the student doesn't have any of these symptoms of anxiety. They look very calm. And after the presentation, they say, I was so nervous, but you have no idea they're nervous. Inside of themselves, they could be very, very upset. Even for myself, I've had this happen to me. I've never really enjoyed public speaking in a theater or a classroom. So I might look calm in the position, but I might have a lot of anxious feelings before the presentation, like my stomach might hurt, I might feel nauseated, something like this. So you're not going to get that from direct observation, only from the self-report. Now, emotions are even more complicated because you can't always see them. They can be difficult to self-report, and emotions are also based in situations. So I might be nervous presenting in a theater or in a classroom, but I might be less nervous when I'm teaching a class on Zoom, or vice versa, right? Some people may be more comfortable in Zoom in person, and then less comfortable when they're in the Zoom. So because emotions are situational, it makes it very difficult for psychologists to accurately study them because they would need to make an experiment. And to make an organic experiment, you would have to deceive someone. If you make an experiment which is not organic, which is not natural, then people know about this. When people know about things, it changes their emotions and their attitudes. So all of this makes it really interesting and really complicated for psychologists to really get to the bottom of emotions. They tend to focus on self-report, and in education, that's interesting for a number of reasons, which I'll go into a bit later on. So I just want to focus, one of the limitations of a psychological view is it tends to focus on an individual. Psychologists do not diagnose societies. They do not diagnose classrooms. They diagnose individuals, and they think about, is an individual okay or not okay? And as I mentioned before, there tends to be a focus on functioning within the larger unit. So historically, this is a quote from 100 years ago in New York City. They said, the High School Teachers Association said comparisons between a school and mercantile establishment, so that would be like a factory. The teacher corresponds to the planning department's manager of the factory. The elements in the enterprise are combined in the student. The elements are the textbook, the charts, and the apparatus. So they associated the teacher to the boss of the factory and the students to the workmen in the factory. And the focus in 1912 in New York City, when they looked at factories, they weren't asking questions like, are the working people happy? Are they fulfilled in life? That wasn't the perspective they had. They had the perspective of efficiency and the benefit of the factory. So the well-being of the workmen, as in the quote, the well-being only becomes important in the context of they're not working hard enough, and they're not working hard enough towards certain preset goals. Likewise, in education, a lot of young people don't want to go to school. They didn't want to go to school 100 years ago in New York, but there's a sense that they're helping society by going to school and contributing to something larger than themselves, and they have to adapt to that system. Today, we find similar views are quite prominent in education and society, and we see a global spread of movements, which really came mostly from the United States across the globe. And both of these movements, I think, have really been enhanced by the economic crises that we faced in the last few decades worldwide. So the first view, which is a bit older from the 1980s, is emotional intelligence. So this again connects the sort of cognitive mental ability to emotions and says that you have to be emotionally intelligent to succeed in life. So so people who were focused on this theory said there's more than one kind of intelligence, but most importantly, they said people need to understand their emotions and they need to be able to adapt their emotions to a situation in order to be intelligent. So that's the definition of the intelligence: understanding your own emotions and controlling your own emotions. Positive psychology is a slightly different trend, and it has focused on positive mental states, thinking that most of psychology has focused on negative pathological states. And it has really focused on the fact that if people cultivate happiness, gratitude, compassion, and these sociable feelings, this is going to benefit them in society. And both of these movements have really taken off in relationship to education and into career development, with a focus on the situation might be difficult, but if you find the resources within yourself, then you can succeed. But there's some challenges and limitations to this psychological view. So one of the questions is focusing on the psychological, is focusing on the emotions of students beneficial for them morally in the long run, or is it just useful for teachers? So sometimes you see policy statements and politicians saying there's a crisis of well-being in society, but often it comes down to classroom management and this idea that people are going to do better in standardized tests if they have emotional well-being. So one of my questions is doing well on standardized tests a moral goal? Is that a moral thing to do? And this becomes really crystal clear in some cases where classroom management seems to be the goal. So then you think, do the teachers just want the children to be well-behaved for the teacher's own benefit, or is this really benefiting young people? In relation to this, do interventions work? So psychological approaches are very popular because they tend to say it's what works. So we know this works, because for researchers like Musumi and I to get grants, we have to say that we understand how things work and we're going to improve something. So psychologists actually feel pressure to say that things work. Now, before I said, you can't really see the emotions in somebody. So I really want to question critically whether these interventions work, because in an educational context, this is how a psychological experiment goes. First, they'll say to young people, it's really important that you have gratitude. If you have gratitude, this is what gratitude is. This is what gratitude looks like. Let's practice having gratitude. And then after the intervention, they're going to ask the young people, do you have more gratitude than you had before? And do you think that it has enhanced your learning? Now, I've thought about this in terms of civic education as well. I think a lot of times this kind of research really doesn't make a lot of sense, because you're sort of teaching the students to parrot what you want them to say. And the young person, so if you teach a young person that they ought to have a certain disposition, if a teacher's teaching that, we don't really know what's inside the student, but certainly they will say that they understand what they've been told. And of course, they're going to try to do what the teacher tells them to do and emulate what is considered to be a good thing, and attribute that to their success because they've just been taught by the teacher that this is important to do because it helps with your success. So I think there's something very tautological happening here, something very uncritical that scholars do, where they say, this works, and you don't really know if it works or not because you're not really going into the person's mind or anything like that. In relation there's a problem with the coherence of concepts. So because we can only evaluate things from the outside, we don't know what exactly is going on. And people have debates about what these concepts, such as gratitude and humility, what they mean. So this is also a challenge when it comes to, is this really working? And all of this should also be considered taking a big step back and thinking about the diversity of students. So not all students have a strong sense of emotional self-understanding. Not all people have a strong sense of emotional understanding. That's one of the reasons I got really interested in this research, is because I thought, is there something wrong with me? I don't know. I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I like to critically question things. I thought, okay, am I happy or am I sad? I don't really know that certainly within myself. So other people feel like me, and they're going to have a problem with this framework. And they might very well pretend like they understand what's happening and feel bad about themselves for not understanding what's happening. Cross-culturally, how you express happiness is different in different contexts. So if a teacher says, when you're happy, you should smile, and you know someone else is happy because they're smiling. In America, that means like a big smile with all your teeth. In Hong Kong, that's not really a sign of appropriate happiness. That is sort of a problematic, it's kind of silly or stupid or casual and unprofessional. So a happiness in Hong Kong will look different. So you can just imagine if you're teaching a student with different backgrounds, it's going to be very complicated to teach these things. And the student might be trying to respond appropriately from their cultural backgrounds, but be hindered in doing so because they understand the virtue differently. So in this context, I think about this very critically because governments have made well-being a part of the educational agenda. I think every country, they're talking about this now. It sort of came out of the US and UK. And you can see it as a moral act because you want people to feel better. And the way positive psychology conceives the situation is that if you feel better, then you are better. The whole point is to feel good, really. That's really the positive psychology view. So I guess it's moral for people to feel good if there's a crisis where people don't feel good. But on the other hand, psychology is focused on results, what works, and what can be observed. And they tend to focus on schools succeeding according to criteria like standardized tests. So you can also imagine these interventions being promoted to keep people working hard, obedient, docile, and resilient, and not complaining about the challenges they face. So one what was I going to say here? You can imagine a teacher saying well-being is really important, and being patient's really important. Like a student might have a real problem, and in the early mental hygiene movement, the politicians 100 years ago, they actually said we need to focus on mental hygiene as the #1 issue because young people have aspirations and goals in society which cannot be met in that society. Young people want to grow up and have a good life and be wealthy and flourishing and have prosperity, and that's not possible. There's a mismatch there. And they said we can either work on the individual or the society. They had no inclination to, make United States a socialist society. So they said, we need to work on this as a mental hygiene issue of the students. So the fact that young people are annoyed that they're going to school and think it's a waste of time when they're not going to flourish after school, when they're just going to be better factory workers, is not really society's problem. It's the individual society. They need to fix their attitude. So this is sort of the flip side or the dark side you could imagine when it comes to the influence of psychological views. In the book, I consider a number of philosophical views as well, deontology and utilitarianism, virtue ethics and care ethics, and Confucianism and Taoism, and to a more minor extent, Buddhism. I'm quite interested in virtue ethics. It has seen a great increase of development, and it's become very popular in philosophy over time. And I think also it's become popular because it kind of goes hand in hand with the psychological discourse in some interesting ways. So from a virtue ethics view, emotions are viewed as outputs of emotions. Emotions are viewed as outputs of virtues. And there's an interplay between emotions and rationality in phronesis or practical wisdom. So when you do something good, you do it because you know it's good, but it's also because you have a feeling about it. So this is the goal of virtue ethics. So if you are honest, it's a feeling as well as a behavior, and virtue ethics strives to have those things go hand in hand rather than you just doing something because you think that you have to. So virtue ethics from Aristotle on to today, virtue ethicists think quite a bit about how to educate virtues and how to educate emotions. And they advocate for a number of things which are actually very similar to what the positive psychologists will recommend when it comes to learning virtues. So emulation and habituation. When it comes to gratitude, a one-year-old doesn't have that much thankfulness or gratitude in them. So you say over time, say thank you, and then if a young person says thank you and they look annoyed, you say, no, that's not right. You have to feel the thanks inside of you. You have to be sincere. So it's a virtue that you're sincere about your feelings. So we know it's not natural for people to have virtues. So there's emulation and habituation. There's instruction, telling people to have it, talking about the benefits of it. And there's practice, writing in a gratitude journal, writing about how virtues are good for your development. Sharing experiences where you have gratitude are highly recommended. Finally, from virtue ethics perspective, you accept that it's always an ongoing process. No one is perfectly virtuous. So I was just in a really interesting seminar about the virtue of modesty and humility. And it's very confusing because if you have modesty and humility, you can't really be proud about it, but there's always this going back and forth about it. So you should be self-aware and self-reflective, but always try to do a better job. So this has really been taken up in education, and especially in the research by the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham in the UK. They have published many things about gratitude and compassion and empathy. They're probably the #1 place that does this stuff. And there's a lot of great virtue ethicists who are based there, such as John Christensen in particular. David Carr has also done a lot of great work on this stuff. So they have a guidebook for young people. It says, if I identify that I'm in the survival zone and my adrenaline level is high, this tells me I want to move zones. I need to reduce my adrenaline, increase my serotonin. So do mindful breathing, spend time with friends, see something funny. I build up activities that will help my emotions in a predictable way. So you can see this really complements the emotional intelligence and positive psychology view. Number one, you understand what you're feeling. Number two, you learn how to control it and regulate it in order to fit in to the situation you find yourself in. But there are challenges and limitations to a virtue ethics view. So virtue ethicists, they will acknowledge that there's cross-cultural differences in virtues. I think they know this. I don't think any people would say that they don't recognize cross-cultural differences, but they don't tend to focus on those cross-cultural differences. I have an issue with that because I think cross-cultural differences are everywhere. Like, I don't think there's a classroom or a meeting or a seminar where everyone has the exact same cultural backgrounds. I don't think that that's really a normal thing, but I think philosophers tend to forget that diversity is a normal part of life. So I don't think they think really critically about this. Another problem is that people's roles and relationships to others are not really considered, and it's just focused on the individual. So does the individual have humility or not have humility? Not really thinking through the situation that you're in and the relationships among people. Related to this, they don't focus on identity factors in social contexts. So when it comes to gratitude, should people have gratitude? Should a teacher have gratitude for their students? This is not something that's commented on as much as the opposites. And these sorts of things make me think that there's some complicated identity issues when it comes to virtues and emotional expectations. We know that women express more gratitude than men in the United States and United Kingdom. I would guess that they express more humility and modesty than men do. And there's social reasons for this. So philosophers tend to live in this very abstract world of people like them in their own culture, but they're not really thinking about the relational issues. And since they're not really focused on the social world, they don't really comment on political or social issues very much. Just like the psychologists, they're really focused on the individual here. So one example, Patrick Fitzgerald has argued that the Dalai Lama, it was really exemplary that he had gratitude in the face of oppression. And he really commended that. And he said, even in a case of harm, someone should have gratitude. Other people, not all people will agree with this. People will say, you need to stand up against injustice. Can you stand up against injustice when you're expressing gratitude? I don't think you can do the same things at the same time. I think you sort of have to pick one or the other. But not everyone feels that way. So this, to me, this is a limitation because education is not just about individual self-cultivation. It's also about making society a better place and participating in the civic and political life of the community that you're in. So this all brings me to the politics of emotions. And I think you probably get a sense already of what I'm getting at here. This view, I say the politics, but it's based in a sociological or sociocultural view, which considers how societies do not function for certain people within them. So from a virtue ethics view and a psychological view, the most important thing is for the individual to fit into the society. Sociologists will point out that the society tends to work better for some people than for other people. And if you think about society as a whole, we could also criticize society as unhealthy, as alienating, although a philosopher and a psychologist just is not disposed to do this. So society and its structures influence our emotions in reality. We don't have emotions free from those influences. And there's this kind of forgetting of that in a lot of the discussion of development of emotions in schools. So when it comes to the politics of educating emotions, students learn to feel belonging or alienation within schools. I think we can all think of a time we felt like we fit in, a time that we felt like we did not fit in school. So this is something that will be interesting to a person from this disposition, not what the individual is doing, but what is the school doing? What is the teacher doing? We know that teachers are like everyone else in the world, and they have biases and prejudices. So some people focus on unconscious bias. A lot of tests have shown that a lot of people have unconscious bias, and that makes them treat men and women differently, expect different things from men and women. There's also conscious bias. A lot of people have traditional views about men and women, about different social groups and how they should treat each other. So this is also sort of a cultural phenomenon as well. And people learn these different expectations about their emotions in school and life. Sometimes people will do this, they'll try to be helpful. They'll think, I know that Chinese students are really quiet, so I'm not going to call on the Chinese students. So this is an example of a case where there's this whole discourse of the way groups are in society, and emotions figure into that. We all learn, I learned that as a white woman, I should be like pretty assertive, pretty confident, and out there, but also respectful of older people, more respectful of men. So everyone kind of learns how they should act in relation to other people around them based on their cultural, language, religion, and so on. And I'm sure this book, my guess is this book needs to be completely rewritten for the Indian context. So if you're thinking that it needs to be rewritten for the Indian context, I'd love to help you with that in any way I can, either collaborating or giving feedback. I'm sure there's a lot of things coming to your mind, which are different than the examples that readily come to my mind. So a lot of this work also has a feminist view. So girls and women are expected to present a lot of happiness. So a lot of the research on happiness is focused on gender. We're expected to be caregivers. We're expected to be naturally better at being caring, for it to make us happy to be caring. This is not expected of men. And I think something like this is true everywhere in the world. That's just my hunch at this point. So such gender stereotypes, they're related to empirically based generalizations. Like, yes, we have data showing that this is the case, but we don't know if it's natural because it can be learned. It obviously is learned because we know it's expectation in society. And it ignores the fact that some women don't want to be that way. So this is an example where a group of people could feel alienated from their own emotions due to a social or cultural expectation. So these are three different views of understanding emotions and how it relates to education and society. So I just want to spend a few minutes. I've already said some things about gratitude and humility, but just to extend the analysis just a bit further in relation to these two emotional virtues. So gratitude, we know it's a feeling of goodwill, of thankfulness, of favor, of appreciation. Most people focus on it as a three-way connection. So there's a person giving a gift to a person, but there's also a general appreciation, which is supported by psychology, because from a psychological view, if I'm happy, it's a nice day, and I feel appreciative about that. It's not that different from I'm happy that people came to my seminar. I'm happy for those people. But this is contested in philosophy. Actually, Aristotle and Kant were not proponents of gratitude. They thought that it made you look weak and indebted to people, and to not be self-sufficient because they valued self-sufficiency. So there's a lot of diversity around how it's valued and how it's understood across societies, which I find really interesting, because I think we tend to assume in our everyday lives it works a certain way. But if there's diversity across societies, that means there's diversity in our neighborhoods as well, as I mentioned before, that is also worth keeping in mind. When people think about the benefits of gratitude, what we found is more and more defenses and articulations that you should have gratitude for a person, General gratitude, it's a nice day. Thankfulness that people are not harming you. And thankfulness, even in the case of harm, as I mentioned before, that you should be grateful to learn from harm. So psychologists and virtue ethicists have spent a lot of time and they've written a lot of papers saying every situation that could possibly exist is a situation you should have gratitude. And I think that this ignores some situations and some complexities around gratitude in reality, in education and society. So they recommend that you learn gratitude, you express it, you think about how you feel, you share about it, write a list, share in your class, and you learn about it. So you're instructed about the benefits of gratitude. But as I've mentioned before, it can be seen as culturally bounded. Different cultures have different views about how to express gratitude, what gratitude feels like, and so on. Even studies comparing UK, USA, and Australia find that they're really conceived quite differently in terms of what the feeling is and the way you express it. As I mentioned, it's socialized based on gender, race, religion, and more. This has definitely been found in United Kingdom, where most of the studies have been done, but I'm sure it's the case elsewhere because these are identity factors that influence who we are and our relationships with other people in society. Meanwhile, they're treated as universal and individualized. And then there's a flip side. So some psychologists are acknowledge that there are negative ways to have gratitude. So in this context, I don't find the interventions very convincing. So like I mentioned before, they instruct young people that gratitude is good. They have people write about gratitude. Then they ask the young people, do you have more gratitude? Do you think gratitude's good? And they say yes, but they were told to say yes. So I don't understand how that's a convincing intervention. I'm simplifying things. Okay, some studies are better than others, but a lot of the studies are really not that much more sophisticated than what I've said compared to the claims about how great gratitude is. So I think we need to nuance those claims with a bit more critical thinking skills. So an example here, there's a gratefulness story that describes how Abraham Lincoln had gratitude despite the hardships of his life, such as his sister dying. Another curriculum for gratitude in the United States asked students to wear blindfolds and then make a drawing. And when the drawing was not a good drawing, to point out the benefit of eyesight. So for me, I think this is quite problematic because I think when it comes to whether or not we have vision, when it comes to our abilities that we are, born with and society can make it difficult or easy for us based on our abilities, to have gratitude for that, I think really misses the point of education for benefiting society. I think it's much better to think about, okay, how is this an unearned privilege? Some people face a disadvantage here. And is there something we should do about that? I think we should do more than just feel good about ourselves when it comes to those situations. And then there's pathology. So I would argue that feeling joy to have privilege over others, that is a pathology. And some psychologists will agree with me, while some won't. But some of that discourse I mentioned before kind of suggests this attitude. Some psychologists will agree with me. Accepting injustices and harms is pathological. It harms you. If somebody is abusive to you, Patrick Fitzgerald argued that if someone's abusive, you can learn from the abuse. A lot of people think that sounds like accepting abuse. And from that perspective, you shouldn't accept abuse. There's challenges for particular groups. Certain religious groups are known to they don't have a strong sense of self because they thank God for everything. So this can become too extreme, and some people from those groups can develop a very pathological sense where they lack self-control because they thank others for everything. So these are some of the challenges with gratitude. When it comes to education, I therefore recommend that we recognize the complex grammar of gratitude. David Carr has also made this argument. Consider when it may not be ideal and prepare for problematic cases. So schools shouldn't stop by just saying, have gratitude, it's always great. they should do a little bit more than that. And there's a great book by Liz Gulliford. She's written a book about gratitude for young people, which shows some of the problematic cases of gratitude. So I'm also interested in working on cases like that in the Hong Kong context to understand where gratitude can be detrimental in our own context here in Hong Kong. To move just quickly to humility. Humility is recognition of one's limitations and particularity. It's believed to increase well-being and tolerance of difference. It can be cultural, civic, or intellectual. It can be a personal feeling and a disposition towards others. So you can easily compare this across cultures like gratitude. There's different cultural conceptions of humility. So it's become more popular in Western culture in the last few years only, but before the last few years, it was not popular at all. Education was seen to decrease, has been seen to decrease humility in some studies. Aristotle, many liberal philosophers, they would argue that you need to really be confident in yourself and confident in your abilities. So they saw it as a negative thing if people were too modest. They saw it as being irrational and underestimating yourself. And they thought it was more important. I mean, it could aid from a virtue perspective. You could be too arrogant or proud, but that's sort of the extreme case for humility. Meanwhile, and now that I'm thinking about it, when I say Western traditions, I think Christianity would not have this view. So actually, a lot of Christians also have a critical view of gratitude. So you can see how there's a lot of intersecting things to consider here. And that's what I just love, is the complexity and the confusion, and to confuse myself with all of this. It's very different in the Chinese tradition because it is deeply embedded in a Confucian view. So Confucius says that the wisest sage must be able to learn from a child. That's not what Aristotle or Immanuel Kant would say at all. So it's very important. It's seen as a virtue for everyone. It's seen to aid hubris and complacence. So there was a concern about these being vices that needed to be corrected, and critical for self-cultivation. And seeing the self as a seeker, but also an impeder of the self, and humility could help with that. So I don't talk about humility in my book, but I do talk about vulnerability. So we often talk about vulnerability as a problem for individuals or organizations to remedy or resolve. But this is different from another view of vulnerability as ontological and existential quality of being a human, where we're all vulnerable. We're all vulnerable to COVID. We're all vulnerable to having, Judith Butler talks about, we're all vulnerable to caring about people and those people not caring about us. It's part of being interdependent, and it's part of being open. So some people argue that in education, vulnerability is critical because you're open to taking risks and being wrong. And if you're invulnerable, you're like out in outer space. You're not part of reality. So vulnerability from a alternative political position, it can be seen as a good thing. The problem is some people have more vulnerability than others. So just like I wonder, why is it that people are saying that people should have gratitude when they're being hurt? I wonder, why is it that the vulnerability is seen as a bad thing for one group, but not for another group? So people on the top of society are sort of invulnerable, right, to criticism, to loss of life and livelihood, compared to ordinary people. So my argument here is that vulnerability needs to be more dispersed across a society. Just like Confucius said that a sage would learn from a child, vulnerability should be more equally distributed. We can't get rid of vulnerability, but it's a problem that some people are more vulnerable than others. So this is my argument here. Vulnerability is educational. Transformational learning is uncomfortable. Uncertainty can be reasonable, although someone who's really rational will want to be against this. Treating diverse others as equal, as unknowable, as people of equal worth requires a vulnerability. And as I mentioned, I would advocate that we recognize it as communal and not individual. So if there's a problem that some people face in society, the society faces that problem. And the society has a problem if there's inequality when it comes to a vulnerability. So that's my arguments there. So we can actually think about how to provide vulnerability to those who don't normally have it. That leaders in society should be challenged, should be encouraged to think about those who are endlessly vulnerable, the precarious who are always on the defense. And I've also thought this deeply in terms of education, but I think I'll skip that. We can talk about it more if you want. So circulating vulnerability then can be done across a group of people and an organization and is seen as a virtue rather than a weakness. So I'm going to stop very abruptly there. I'm happy to talk about other aspects of the book or the arguments, and I'm very happy to also hear about examples from India. Like I said, I don't have expertise in the Indian context, so I would love to hear more about that. So I will finish now and yeah, look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Liz, for that very interesting talk and letting us know about your book, recent publication. And I'm sure all those who are students here in this room, you have got a wonderful overview how an interdisciplinary work really looks like. Though Liz herself is a philosopher of education, her primary interest in philosophy, but she has very nicely presented us a psychological view of gratitude, humility, and all these, virtues and emotions. She has and also highlighted the limitations of it, but she has also provided us philosophical views and also highlighted the limitations of it. And very nicely, she has herself taken both she has drawn in from psychology, from philosophy, and also from sociology to analyze and problematize the very concept of educating the emotions and very nicely analyze the politics of educating emotions within schooling contexts in mostly Western countries and also in the context of Hong Kong. Before I would ask any question, I'm sure many of you in this room must be having some questions in your mind. And as Liz already said, she would really like to hear Indian perspectives from you. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions to Liz. Who's going to go first? Okay, Nishta, and then Pulkit. Okay, Nishta first. Go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. I really liked your book. First, I'd like to say. So I had one pressing question when I was reading the book and I was listening to you today. So mostly in India and otherwise also, policies are made either at the national level or the state level, both of which are very big, diverse entities. And classrooms are usually like very diverse in terms of gender. And in India, there's the caste system and other social groups. So, how can we or can we have a policy, a one size fits policy, and be implemented like throughout that that diverse classroom? Because usually policies are not made at the local level. So, is it possible to have such policies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think my initial concern, and I think like probably the overall orientation of the book would be that that is a challenge when it comes to educating emotions, that things are standardized across a state or across the entire country. On the other hand, even in a localized setting, you can have this problem with diversity where within any community, even a small community, there can be one group that's dominant over another group, and that might be different from the national or state level. So even at the local level, you could have that happen. I guess when it comes to a universal standard, I would advocate for understanding of the what I call the complex grammar of the education of emotions throughout. So if you could have that that feedback for teachers or that curriculum to include in it, emphasizing there are cultural differences. People do face different challenges based on their identity factors. Reminders for teachers specifically, like, are you expecting the girls to have more gratitude than the boys, or something like this? So I think that if it's more, I think there's ways to encourage a critical view of emotions in the curriculum. But I don't know if that's going to happen, because the curriculum tends to like make things more simple. This is always a problem I have. So it standardizes across a system, and at the same time, it kind of takes complicated things and makes them simple. And I would really just want to bring back the complexity. But I think that would also be beneficial for society as a whole, because like I mentioned, the really rigid discourse from emotional intelligence that everyone can understand their feelings and regulate them, that's not really the case for everyone. So that's where I think it could actually be harmful for young people if they're taught that they should feel something that they don't feel. And that's where governments should really just exercise a lot more caution than they are. And I also blame the psychologists for this and the way the grant industry works, because psychologists are pressured to say X thing works, it works for everyone. And it does work in a certain way. But if we really care about well-being, that's not really what they're doing necessarily. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts on that.
Just one more small question. So, all through the chapters that I read in your book, one idea that I'm getting is you can't over prioritize any emotion. Like, it may be good for you and bad for you. You can't over prioritize it. So, in a sense that in different situations, you express different amounts of different emotions, right? So, and in that sense, you also give this example that one of the previous scholar has given of pedagogy of autonomy and control. So it's like you give the student agency to decide which emotion they deem appropriate to express at the moment. But since all of the students, like, come from different cultures where they have different set of models, what do you think can be the pitfall of providing this kind of agency or autonomy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you were saying that, I was thinking those are the sorts of things I'd actually want to emphasize at a national or a state level. Is emotions, their emotions aren't good or bad. It depends on the situation. Sometimes you should have anger. Sometimes you should be sad. Sometimes you should be happy. And then the second part of that is it is a lot more individual than we think, and we should think twice before. And I think often it's not necessarily politicians being evil. It's just natural that a teacher wants their students to be happy, but then they're not thinking critically about a student can't be happy all the time. And maybe they are happy, but they're not expressing it in a way that you're familiar with. Yeah, so this is a great articulation of a limitation of the book, which I'm really grateful for, is I do kind of end up saying in a way, like, the young people know what they should feel, not the teacher. And I guess I would just say when it comes, maybe there's kind of a dialectic between the pedagogy of autonomy and the pedagogy of control. So schools are there to control, they are there to teach a curriculum. We as a society have decided that young people do not have the right to not go through these things that we're making them go through. On the other hand, we can't control the students absolutely. That's really harmful for them. So it might also just be about having an open dialogue about these things, where the teacher can say, okay, so I've heard parents say this to their children, like, you're allowed to feel whatever you're feeling, but don't hit someone, don't scream, don't cry in this situation. So I think this is probably aligned with the virtue ethics view too, where in a situation there's an appropriateness. The teacher's not the expert on the appropriateness, but the teacher does have an influence to encourage the young person to think about the appropriateness. And it should be part of their job. It could be part of their job to say, why are you upset right now? Let's actually think about this. So that could be a helpful thing. But there's no right answer. And I do tend to err on the side of criticizing things rather than making solutions for things, of saying, here's what's wrong with doing this, rather than having a good solution. But it's great to think about this more. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Nishta, for the questions. We'll move to now, there are quite a few questions. We'll move to Pulkit and then Ishita, and then there's also a question on chat. Pulkit, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for your lovely talk. And thank you, Dr. Mukherjee, for bringing this to us at JGU. So since you mentioned that, multiple points in your talk, you wanted to know more about Indian perspectives, I just very briefly wanted to share with you that I work in the area of positive psychology, particularly with social emotional learning and interventions for school students. And you also mentioned this idea about practice and instruction, and how writing journals is something that, we've all been brought to believe is a wonderful thing to do. And we thought as much until we tried out this practice with a bunch of 11 to 14-year-old kids across various schools in North India, and found that rather than, enhancing their well-being, it turned out to be slightly counterproductive. Because when we spoke to these children, we understood that within the typical conventional school education system in India, there's so much focus on written work that they actually perceived the idea of journaling as one more piece of written homework that had been sent in. Plus the whole idea of, being asked to sit and think about how did my day go, what worked well. They said that, ma'am, it actually stressed me out because I thought that now I've got 5 more pages to write every day. So that's really, I think, connecting with the same thing that you've been saying, the need to respect diversity and to understand that what works at one place, you can't just directly import it and force fit it in other contexts. So yeah, I wanted to share that with you. And if you allow me just 30 more seconds, because I practice positive psychology, I, sort of felt like rushing to say that, hey, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are certain things that are wrong with, the way they are done, but there are also equally more sophisticated calls now for, so this acronym, which is slightly problematic, but the whole idea of WEIRD, weird, which is how most of our work is coming from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic nations, underrepresenting others, the one where we are at the moment. So just to say that the field is trying to become more inclusive, and I worry if we were to suddenly boycott this as saying that, hey, these interventions are very superficial and let's not go forward. It's okay to acknowledge the limitations and try and overcome them gradually. What would you think of that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, I wasn't sure who the audience would be, and sometimes I do kind of pick on positive psychology. And in the book, I try not to pick on all the positive psychologists. But you're absolutely right. Like they were onto something. Part of why I wrote this book was because I used to be more critical of psychology than I am today. The more I talk with psychologists, the more I realize that they have very valuable perspectives and really should be considered more. So absolutely, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the with the bathwater there. I guess I'm also critical of it because I'm worried about it when it is that kind of like an American intervention. And there's also been research done in UK where they'll say like, this is just too American, this isn't appropriate for us. So the critique of positive psychology would go hand in hand with that like very American centric critique. So yeah, I think there is something, and there can be, so there are some positive psychologists who do really rich work, but there's been a tendency, so there's been tendencies to not focus on the situation, the specific context, the specific students in order to get sort of more generalizable data. And like on the one hand, that can be important to make things to work towards greater validity, I think. But then on the other hand, it can be a challenge when it comes to practically implementing something in a fair and safe way. And I learned a lot writing the book from social psychologists. And I think the other issue is the government tends to take the simplified what works, like what I was saying before. They focus on what works, and then they kind of try to simplify it and dumb it down so it works for everyone and is standardizable. And then that's sort of the government throwing the baby out with the bathwater to a certain extent, because they are taking the positive research. And some psychologists have discussed this with me, how they're afraid of the government taking something they say and kind of changing it for their own desires, which might be different from the goals that the psychologists actually had. And that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing about the context there. I'd love to hear more about it. So feel free to email me if you want to share about it more, and anyone else if they have other interesting examples. I'm also doing a special issue of the journal Education, Philosophy, and Theory with a colleague looking at humility from different cultural perspectives. So if you have any interesting inspiration on that topic, definitely email me, and I'd love to hear more.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Pulkit, for your question. And I'm definitely going to share the call for papers for the special issue that Liz mentioned with all of you. And if any of you interested, welcome to submit your paper. Yes, Ishita, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Liz, so much. That was a great talk. And my question actually ties in very wonderfully to some of the last points you made, one of which was the cultural notions of virtue. And I was wondering, if how much influence does, so, one is that the definition of virtues and how it is being received by diverse group of people, that's like one direction, that's one vector. But at the same time, there's also these diverse subjectivities crafting their own notions of virtues as well, right? So where would then, I quite liked the idea of going beyond virtue. And, I'd love to read the book in whole as well after this talk. But also the question then becomes very pertinent, that how it's not just whether women are more, women express more gratitude than men, but it is also that women are taught that gratitude is a virtue much more than men. So there is also what gets defined as being virtuous in what demographic, under what cultural conditions, and under what situatedness that each of these subjectivities occupy, right? So that is one question. And the second question, because I'm an architect and I was wondering about the idea of the learning environments within which we can have conversations about virtue. Because so many of the discussions that we just had were also about how the classroom regulates the teaching of emotions, the teaching of virtues, and it's that regulatory nature that perhaps also leaves the definitions narrowed. And do you think it would benefit if, say, we take this entire educating virtues exercise outside of the classroom, outside, like, out into the real field? Like, I know since the last 10 days, and Moshumi here and some of my other colleagues would agree, a lot of us who are teaching have had to bring what's happening on the Indian Twitter into the classroom and acknowledge the kind of emotional damage that that is causing, not just to the students, but also to us, right? So it quite literally has flattened the hierarchy and magnified the kind of emotional, I would say, hit that all of us are taking collectively as a community. So, and in that case, what happens is that there is nobody, like I don't know more than my students on how to process this. And it is in that scenario that, you know, a very fluid dialogue gets established. And then our definition of what would be considered virtuous, what do you have to say on crafting learning environments which move out into such directions?
Yeah, those are some really interesting examples. And I can only imagine the situation in India, barely. I know we've had a lot of stress here in Hong Kong over the year and a half as well. So I think related to your first points, I'm quite interested in the way people learn emotions and how that happens in different subject groups. So I think anger is a really good example. Like if a man in sort of the majority category is angry, like the media will say, oh, he's so passionate, he's so convinced and is committed to his cause. Right. But for a woman to be angry, it can be seen as bad. And then actually, in a lot of civic spaces, if someone is in a minority group and comes in with anger, they'll actually say, you're interrupting the democratic discourse, you're interrupting the dialogue, because so actually like those groups of people just aren't allowed to have anger. So I think it's really important to like think through a very specific context. And it is sort of intersectional, depends on the situation and the environment, and the sort of diversity. And there's sort of this traditional conception of diversity and multiculturalism. But I think probably in India, you are used to breaking that down and really saying, okay, this is more complicated than that. It's not just men and women, or on this issue, women face a slightly different thing if they're in this racial group or ethnic group versus this one. So I think that's part of the complexity of the emotions. Is that sort of what you were getting at, or was there?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, to present a very, I think most Indians would relate to it, that if you are, say, born as a girl to a family and you perform very well, you become a high performer female child of the family, then your virtue is recognized, that you know you have been like a son to this family, right? So all these other virtues that you have accrued on the way and practiced and, you know, navigated being a female in an otherwise male dominated world, all get subsumed because it is considered that all of that was in service of becoming the, you know, male of the family, right? So what happens is, no matter what you practice as a virtue, if you let go of gratitude as a woman in order to be a man of the family, that is also considered to be virtuous. So that's when this I think the monolithic nature of each of these virtues sort of would break down in a, you know, society which is so I don't know, subsumable in it. How do you put this, Moshami, if this makes sense?
So even the woman achieving, you know, the virtue of it is really recognized, is being recognized as something you have been, like you've been the man or the son of the house, right? So of course the gendered stereotypes that the society has, that does play into even the construction of the virtue itself in a gendered way.
Yeah.
And I think
so would it perhaps, as a way of a method, like would it help in such a scenario to locate the production, or what Moshami said, the construction of virtue, the idea of virtue, at multiple, on multiple grounds and in multiple soils, and, recognize that they need to be cultivated and nurtured, and, each of it would need like a different pesticide, and, a different fertilizer and different watering times. And then each of these emergence of what is considered virtue in different soils would become diverse, right? So we no longer say that gratitude is a virtue, and it should be practiced by everybody, and men practice it less than women do. But I think it would emerge as a much more complex landscape of virtues.
Yeah, definitely. What you say reminds me of the complexity of identity as well. So that's sort of another layer of this is our identity. So yeah, we shouldn't have gratitude all the time, but then our relationship to that virtue being a good thing, whether or not that virtue is good for us, actually changes based on our identity within a situation and our relationship to others. So I try to emphasize that these are very relational. So it's not just like I'm this person in this context, but yeah, in my family, I might express more gratitude than when I go out with my friends. And it's because my identity changes in that position. And with that too, I think the other side of this, what you're really recognizing and pointing to here too is the fluidity of identity. Like I'm not just a woman, and I become a more powerful woman, and then I'm practically a man, and that makes things much more complicated. So it's not just the case of watch out how you're treating, and sort of like gender and race and these things. It's almost like these are they're markers of these power relationships, but they're not actually the essential thing. Like, so you could tell a teacher, try not to treat the boys different from the girls, but then there could be a really a girl from a very important position in the class that they naturally treat much better than the boys. And so it's very hard to generalize about these things in a productive way. I really love your question about the architecture, and I'm also thinking about it in relation to Zoom. When you mentioned what you've done in India with working with students, I've actually tried to do the same thing lately. And I think this is part of where I have an overall vision of education in my work, where the teacher just has less authority, and they're less dedicated to controlling their authority, because a lot of educational discourse acts like teachers should be in control. They should understand the classroom. They should understand the students. They should manage the classroom and the students. And I think what your example points to, and what my positive experiences point to, is like no one's an expert on emotions, and no one's an expert on everyone else's emotions. So I just imagine a teacher, grading the gratitude of students. And I don't think that is exactly happening anywhere, but I'm afraid that could happen somewhere. So, I mean, especially when you see so many people saying how gratitude's good in every situation and for everyone, I'm worried about it going in that direction. And I think it's important. I think the next part of this, and it's sort of like humility is actually at the base of all of this, because I would like teachers to say, I don't know how you should feel right now. I don't know how I should feel right now. And the other part of that is we shouldn't judge other people's emotions. So this is one issue I have with some of the prominent positive psychologists in the past, is they've been a little bit judgmental about people who lack emotional intelligence and lack emotional understanding. And some people are more angry than others, and it's probably not like their fault. It's not like someone said, I'm going to be angry and people aren't going to like me and I want it to be that way. No one's like that. So we shouldn't, especially if you're thinking about a classroom of 5-year-olds or a classroom of teenagers or 20 somethings. I mean, any group with the horrible problems we're facing today, we should all take a step back, and rather than say, we all need to have this professional, calm demeanor, say, some people are angry and some people are sad, and that's okay. And I think that that's really vital, so that we don't all just act like robots, because we can actually use the anger and the sadness that we're facing today. And if we just hold it inside of ourselves, that's actually worse for our mental well-being too.
Thank you so much.
mental. Thank you, Shita, for the question. But Liz, I was just thinking as you were speaking, I think it's not just mental well-being, also physical well-being. And this
Yeah.
reminds me of, my personal story. Frankly speaking, I can share it with all of you. Uh, no problem with that. And this was many years ago when I was in high school. Okay, and I started developing some health symptoms, really bad digestion issue, issues related to digestion, and there was no apparent reason behind it. So my mother took me to a doctor, and this doctor has been seeing me since childhood, and she was like clueless, like what's the reason why she's having such difficult digestion issue, and all there's nothing wrong with the food, nothing. And then suddenly, after my mother was finished speaking, the doctor said, do you ever allow her to express her emotions? And then my mother said in our mother tongue, native language, oh, if I would translate that into English, girls are supposed to be, Loki is Indian Hindu goddess who is very, docile, calm, and quiet. Under all circumstances, she's supposed to be calm. So there's a there's a terminology in the native language, Lokhi me, and it's not just in Bengali, even in Hindi and other Indian languages, girls are supposed to be Lokhi. Oh, she's always calm. My daughter is a Lokhi. She's always calm. So uh, the pedagogy of control, if I would use the terminology that you use, how it really and the politics of educating emotion, how it starts in the home itself. And the doctor immediately said, you see, that's the root of your daughter's problem. She's a young girl, she's an adolescent, she's growing up. I'm sure she has different kinds, she experiences different kinds of emotions. You have never allowed her to express her negative emotions. You have literally kept her constantly, because by this discourse of Lokime, the calm and quiet and docile daughter, all of you, the entire family, have literally, so she is like a pressure cooker inside. So all these digestion related health issues that she is having is because of that, this emotional suppression that she's having inside. And my mother was like, it was a revelation for her. And that's what I was really thinking when you were talking about, mental well-being. Not just mental, it can have real physiological impact on the student, or whoever the person is.
Yeah, so I think things like that, definitely they happen in the US too, with girls and women. And that's where I think it's the job of the educator too. So I think it's not responsible in that context for educator to just say, okay, happiness is good, calmness is good. I think they need to be aware of that family influence, media influence, and really respond to all of that and recognize all that when they go in the classroom, not just be like, okay, Masumi's upset today, that's bad. But okay, it might be bad if Masumi's never upset. That could be bad.
Right. Okay, I have another colleague, Tatiana, who has raised. Tatiana, please go ahead. And
Yeah,
we also have a question on the chat. Please go
y-
ahead, Tatiana.
thank you so much. I will be brief because we are running of time. First of all, thanks a lot for your illuminating presentation. I love it. I seriously love it, Liz. And I didn't even notice that my computer was running off charge. It became almost empty in terms of charge. I didn't notice that because I became so engaged. Thank you so much. Just a couple of points I would like to add. My argument would be that some virtues can be called as truly universal, and I would wonder whether you would agree with me or not. Uh, Paul Kidd, I think, mentioned that we should differentiate depending on different backgrounds and different societal environment. But I think the virtues like gratitude and humility, it should be practiced across the world, regardless of ethnic background, nationalities, gender. And I think in terms of these particular virtues, it's never enough. It would never be enough of them. In terms of gratitude, we can, wherever possible, we can express that. And humility also, it should come even from the high-ranking politicians. Recently, during my classes, I made example of, for example, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He publicly apologized in the year 2016 for the events dated 100 years ago when Indian Sikhs were sent back to India. They were not accepted in Canada, and then eventually they were killed. So he expressed this humility. He found this courage to express publicly apology, a sincere apology for the deals he was not involved personally, right? But then another extreme is that this Recep Erdogan from Turkey, he continuously refuses to express apology for genocide of Armenians, right? So it should start even from the high-ranking officials. And the last point I would like to make here, if possible, vulnerability. I think in one of your last slides, you mentioned that vulnerability should be more or less equally dispersed across different segments of the society, right? So why should the underprivileged, marginalized people, why should they be viewed more vulnerable? Why should they feel themselves more vulnerable compared to the high-ranking officials? But I think it is, you see, unfortunately, it has to do with the inequalities, social inequalities, right? We cannot do much about it, unfortunately, because many top-ranking officials, they become selfish. They hardly bother about the well-being of the members of the civil society. So we cannot expect much here in terms of, like you mentioned, more or less equal dispersion of vulnerability. Inherently, they cannot feel vulnerable because their well-being is secured. Right, they will be insecure, so you cannot expect much from them, right? They're not vulnerable by nature. Thank you once again, and I apologize for making this long speech. I just wanted to share my views. Thank you.
Okay, Liz, just a sec. Before you respond to Tatiana, I just wanted to share there's another question in the chat. If you can respond to both as we wrap up. Steady is asking that how do you see gratitude with regards to self-respect?
Okay, great. So thanks so much for all of that sharing, Tatiana. It's really interesting. And it's been great to hear from everyone. I should have talked less so we could have more discussion. It's really interesting. So I'll just say a few short things in reply. A lot of what you said resonated with me and I think is right on. So when it comes to virtues being universal, I think you're right. I think happiness, compassion, gratitude, fear, anger these are definitely universal. But I think the thing is the way that they are expressed and like some of the like the way, like, do you smile? Do you not smile? How do you express it? Some of this is social and cultural, and then like the situational aspect of it. So like how you should express yourself at a funeral, for example. Every society has a view about this, but societies will have different views about it. And so this is research I'm really interested in, and still doing research on this topic, because I think like happiness is thought of very differently in Chinese culture than in American culture, for example. They both definitely have it, but it will be, I would argue, structured differently in different situation, different roles, and the way that you express it in that context. Your point about vulnerability and its circulation, I think is a really good point. It is impossible because people don't want to feel insecure. As you mentioned, leaders don't want to feel insecure. So yes, I agree with you, but I would say that this is something that we can do as educators, is we can encourage people to see vulnerability, insecurity, modesty, humility, open-mindedness as all kind of clustered together and going in the right direction. And we can, in a classroom setting, we can try to think about distributing it more equally, having everyone be open to criticism equally, saying in our classrooms, upholding political leaders who allow themselves to be vulnerable. So my goal with this kind of discussion is to just kind of tilt the discourse and shove it in a different direction gradually. So yeah, the president's not vulnerable, but we should encourage young people to think about that critically and encourage people to think, okay, if I'm the president, then I'm going to be more vulnerable, that kind of thing. And we can do that in education space too. Like a principal of a school can exhibit vulnerability. A principal of a school can act like he cares about the teachers and the students and about their opinion. And every leader is better or worse at this. So I just want to orientate us towards this possibility, which maybe it's impossible today, but first we can think about it, and then it could be possible in the future. The last question about how do I see gratitude in regard to self-respect? I don't think I mentioned self-respect specifically, but this question is really right on in terms of a lot of people think that there's a tension between the two. And from a virtue perspective and from a psychological perspective as well, if you have too much gratitude in certain situation, that can be pathological and a sign that you lack self-respect. So a lot of people have replied to Patrick Fitzgerald. Actually, Patrick Fitzgerald has said, the sign that gratitude is okay is if you have self-respect. But for me, that doesn't quite finish the conversation, because self-respect, if we think about humility, self-respect looks differently across cultures as well. And one person's self-respect looks different from another person, because people are different, and because people have different sense of what is respect and what should one owe to oneself and be owed if they are treated well. But it's all part of the same complicated question. And I think they should be discussed together in a classroom, right? Are you accepting an injustice? Are you accepting someone disrespecting you? Do you still have self-respect? Don't just stop with gratitude, but ask those critical questions as well. And think about, and it might be too, in one situation, gratitude's more important than self-respect, although I think usually self-respect is almost, if not always, more valuable, and gratitude would be judged based on whether or not there's self-respect. But I would encourage, critical discussions of the relationship between the two in education settings, rather than that sense that gratitude is most important, because people will have kind of a loss of sense of self if they have too much gratitude, and self-respect will be one part of that. So thanks for that question.
There is actually another question that has come up on the chat, and Liz, if you have 5 more minutes and if you don't mind responding to this question, I would like to ask it. Krishna Kumar, he's asking the question, can you highlight some insights how gratitude can be used in education? And he says that I adore your views and perspectives, and really thanks for a wonderful webinar.
So highlighting the insights on how gratitude can be used in education. So we've mentioned a few times sort of like the architecture of the classroom and the environment and the relationality of the gratitude. So I think what it means for a teacher to have gratitude and a principal to have gratitude could also be considered. And then those critical contexts where gratitude comes up. So I mentioned a book by Liz Gulliford on gratitude. She has a book for children, and she has a number of stories where gratitude becomes complicated. So one of the stories, there's 2 girls, and one girl gives her friend a nice pair of earrings that the girl really loves, and she's so happy she gets the earrings and she has gratitude. But then the next day, the friend asks if she can cheat off of her paper. And then she feels really confused. Did the person give me a gift, or did the person manipulate me? So I think that this is an example. So rather than saying that gratitude is always good, to think about when is times where it's difficult, when are times when it's not the right response to something. And I've written a few articles on this topic too, so happy to discuss it with you more. Feel free to get in touch with me if you want to throw around more ideas.
It would be good if you can share your email list, or I can also send it out to everybody. Yes, there it is. So feel free to email Liz, and she is very good with email replies and would be happy to respond to students' queries and questions regarding specifically regarding the topic of gratitude. Okay. We have run out of time, and thank you so much, Liz, for this webinar and sharing your time and responding to so many questions from our students and colleagues. We really hope that someday we can bring you situations would improve.
I'd love that. Yeah.
Oh, we will be all very grateful when it does, and when we can really physically meet and see each other again. Thank you very much on behalf of the entire team over here, all the students and faculty who attended today's session, and those who couldn't, but they will be listening to the recording of this webinar. Thank you very much once again, and we look forward to have further conversation with you, and maybe, as you said, do some work together and bring look at Indian perspectives on these emotions, and we look forward to work with you more. And I hope you have a good day ahead, and hopefully we will catch up again in the near future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, feel free to be in touch with me, and we'll talk again soon. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.